Hello! I'm Helgast, and I'm happy to say that I've gotten to the bottom of it. I've spent the time to figure out if I'm actually some sort of brand. After seeing some doctors, they've diagnosed me with being a stupid fucking moron because I am a human. However, they also made an alarming discovery that being a gamer, my body is 37% of Mountain Dew while another 30% is contained of these orange triangles. Thank God I have that figured out. Too bad I also live in America, so now I have the classic hospital debt. So I have no choice but to go back to my backlog in order to make some sort of cash. Now, if you ignore that this channel isn't monetized, then this is a great plot structure for a video. This is a great moment for me to insert that you should like and subscribe. So in order to actually make a video, I picked number 50, Foreclosed. A third-person cyberpunk action game that is fucking ambitious for a small team of about 3 to 4 devs. Let's see if this game is actually worth checking out or something to just ignore. So let's start with the game's graphics. I normally don't go through the game's graphics because if you're playing a video game, I'm going under an assumption that you have some sort of sight, but for Foreclosed I'm talking about it since it's attempting an ambitious look, since the genre is an aesthetic that's hard to replicate even on big budgets. With cyberpunk, a lot of games tend to go and hit on the same visual style, of a city filled to the brim with neon and enough advertisements to kill the biggest capitalist. So it's really like living in an 80s comic book, where the world is colorful, but it's filled with murderers and worse, scammers. However, Foreclosed has the design of a modern city without all the colorful noise. Whether it's purposely designed this way, or they just didn't have the budget to fill it to the brim with neon, it's a neat way of showing off cyberpunk's base roots of high-tech, low lifestyle, with technology being unnecessarily complicated for the sake of being complicated, which is sort of similar to Facebook wanting to make metaverse, because nothing is more exciting to use my VR headset to walk around a virtual Walmart than going to a Walmart myself, or, you know, using Uber Food or whatever it's called. But here everything seems to be connected to the blockchain, which sounds convenient, but when it seems to be tied into our fridge, something has gone horribly wrong. Another example is to transfer funds requires this Game Boy looking ass, which comes with a dumb minigame, which can be easily hacked, which makes everything being inconvenient for the people of the area. Plus, having something this inconvenient means that some company is probably taking a cut out of each transaction, which is something that isn't directly said, but let's be real, it would exist. It just shows that the world might be full of tech, but the minimum wage is probably still $8. It's neat to see the style of cyberpunk is here, but without all the eye candy that others tend to have. Now, there is some moments the game decides to have small pieces of eye candy. For example, you have lost your identity, the government has put blockers into your cybernetics, causing for pop-ups to show up blocking you. But having more drab and down-to-earth elements makes the world feel more natural than having every block look like it's Times Square, or worse, your gaming PC. Why does it have so many lights on the inside? Now, there are moments that really hit that 80s sci-fi moment, like fighting in a club with a mild shake-up to the visuals. It all really works in the game to make a decent cyberpunk game, visually. So let's move on to the gameplay where the game starts to stumble. While the visual department I only had good things to say, the same cannot be said about the gameplay. If you want the shorthand version of this, the game is rough in a lot of areas, which can make most sections in the game just not fun to play at times. To properly talk about this, we're going to break the gameplay down in a few styles that the game loves to change between. Starting with the first style, which happens to be these puzzles, if you can even call them that. These sections play before or right after a combat section. The first types tend to be find X switch for X door, and for most of these, you have to do it 3 times. These start out being rather decent, with the switches being in some simple places for us to find, to us having to find them in dumb areas, which tends for us to find a vent, which tend to be hard to see in some cases. Makes me wish that there was a light or a different coloring to make it stand out, or of course, don't have the damn vent be there since it's fucking annoying to see, because in your cyberpunk third-person game, I shouldn't be reminded of wall humping for secrets in Doom or Doom 2. The second type of puzzle is when you start walking around and a signal will appear on the top of your screen. You need to walk around until it fills up and then look for an either green or blue node. If it happens to be a green node, you'll be rewarded with additional XP, while the blue ones tend to be for a puzzle which requires you to find multiple, normally in groups of 3. These are rather easy since the dev likes to put them in obvious places. These tend to just be out of the way, making them no problem to find. These don't really do much most of the time, and how frequently they're used, the puzzle's main purpose is to give breaks for the combat. With how short the game is, they could have cut out a few puzzles and tightened up the combat a bit more, especially since there are already other options to break up the combat, like story sections where we have some choices to ask characters about lore elements. While the combat might be the main focus of the game, we're going to tackle on the game's stealth mechanics. Stealth is the second gameplay style, which doesn't happen often for the game. For 90% of the stealth encounters, they follow basic rules. These rules are that enemies have a vision cone in front of them, where if you get into the cone, it'll start to fill up a small gauge that has to be filled before you're noticed. You're not vulnerable during these sections as you have a stealth takedown. It works like most games where you have to get close to the enemy and a prompt appears. Pressing the prompt starts the minigame where you have to smash the X button. Failing it causes for the takedown to be successful. Now I do like the different kind of animation, versus the typical choke man takedown plenty of other games do. Bodies that are on the ground won't be seen by the guards, so you don't have to put too much thought in how to do the stealth successfully. The only other thing that the AI will take account of is if you roll near them, they'll actually take notice and investigate the area you're rolling around. While the majority of the time it follows these rules, the 10% brings these drones where the stealth sections become unfun. This happens late in the game, but the change-up is really annoying due to how they act. They're flying enemies, so they can see more due to their height. That could have been an alright change-up and challenge, but they have some inconsistencies with them, which is worse now that getting spotted by them is an instant game over, which drags this one section out longer than it needed, as the gimmick of the entire section is that you have to sneak past to get to a door, only to find that the door is locked, where we are tasked with going back to find 3 nodes to open the door, which would be fine except they hit you doing it 3 times in a row immediately. The section wouldn't have been bad, but the drones being inconsistent of what they can see you kills it for me. Since there were moments I should have been caught but the drone shrugged it off. Then there were other moments where I was hidden but the drone decided that living privileges had to be taken away. But the icing on the cake is that the checkpoints for this section are just fucking bad. Since you can fail at the second door, you'll be brought back to the start of the level, while at the third door you won't be brought back to the start but at the third door, which makes it tedious since the second door is the one where the game's drones feel a bit jank in what they see. Plus they decided to have one of the nodes be off screen from the drones. While I can't see them, they can still see me, which caused me to replay this section more times than I want to admit, which meant beating the first door constantly. I wish this was changed so the nodes increase with each door you did, to lower down how tedious it is. So the first door would have 1 drone and 1 node, then door 2 has 2 drones, so 2 nodes. The final door would have 3 drones and 3 nodes. This would slowly add challenge to the whole thing. This section only comes out in a single level, so they could have cut it so that there was more time put into the combat. Speaking of which, let's actually talk about the game's roughest area. Let's talk combat. The combat tends to be the most frustrating element since there's a good combat buried under all of this. It all comes down to the sloppy execution. Being a third-person shooter, we can only use a single gun throughout the game. The gun has 2 different firing modes. The first one fires normal bullets. The mode has unlimited ammo, little recoil, and small damage, which makes it good at getting headshots. The second mode is more of a pulse or an electric shot. I think it deals more damage than the basic mode, it's hard to tell. Instead, this mode can utilize mods, which are unlocked by getting XP from either combat arenas or finding green nodes. These mods change the gun quite a bit as they range from changing the weapon from semi-auto to full auto, having explosive bullets, or how about armor-piercing rounds? The gun can only hold up to 3 mods at once, making for some fun experimentation of what you like. While the experimentation is limited due to the game having a total of 6 gun mods, but that's made up with the usefulness most of the mods have. The mods make the gun really strong, which is why every shot builds up heat. If you fill up the heat bar, it stuns your character, which only lasts a moment, but that's just enough time for the enemies to kill you. Plus, if you want to use the powers you have access to, you'll need to balance out both your heat usage and what skill points to spend, unless you find yourself in the same boat I was in, since the game doesn't let you know about the second firing mode for a while. I ended up getting the shield ability, which makes you invincible for a small amount of time, at the cost of using all of your heat, so you can't use the secondary mode. Now, mentioning the game has different abilities and mods gives the illusion that the game has interesting combat. I wish, as the actual combat is clunky, which adds unintentional difficulty spikes. At least I hope it's unintentional. It's hard to explain why controls can feel bad or off in a game unless it's extremely obvious. As to footage, it looks like your traditional third-person shooter that I'm bad at. While I might not be a word wizard, I'll attempt to explain the problems, starting with the gun having a slight delay when you press the aim button, making it impossible to react to new enemies that are in your face or being really aggressive. While messing with the sensitivity in the game options, I couldn't find that sweet spot, as it was either too slow or too fast, which makes the game rough to play at times. But to really break down some of the jank, let's talk about the dodge mechanic. It's the first mechanic that we're taught about, as it shows that we can dodge bullets. A mechanic like this seems like it would play an integral part in the combat loop, allowing players to dodge roll around shots, just for you to pull out your own piece and start blasting whoever happens to be in front of you. But you can't, since you can't aim and roll at the same time, since the roll button is mapped to an ability button. So if you want to dodge in combat, you have to stop aiming, dodge, then press aim, and wait that slight delay, which is just slow enough that the enemies are ready or have already started shooting you. It's the classic recipe of getting shot with extra steps. Without the dodge, the game boils into a third-person cover shooter, just without the cover mechanics, which makes the game become very samey since the best strategy is to sit back and wait for your turn to shoot, or attempt to tank some bullets since the enemies don't know when to stop shooting for a moment. So you need to drop the enemies fast, and the best method is by getting a headshot, which takes either 1 or 3 shots. I don't know what causes it to be inconsistent, since these guys aren't wearing helmets, that comes later. At least most times the enemies don't move and they stay in their spot shooting you. Well, until the game gets bored and decides to spawn enemies behind you, where sometimes they have an audio cue like a man shouting "I'm taking the shot" so you know what's happening. Then later on, the game's heads up is by shooting you, most of the time killing you on your first attempt. Or my other favorite idea the game tends to pull, of having the combat arena be done, where it opens the door and when you walk through the door, you greet to an enemy point blank where your first try, you're probably going to die, since the way the game handles damage seems to be distance based. Where being far away, it's like a bee sting, but when they get close, it's like a bee sting except the bee is the size of a truck. While point blank shots you have to dodge since no matter what, they seem to be lethal on us, making moments like this that much more frustrating than it has to be. Especially since they have this mechanic to prevent this where we can see enemies through walls. But I guess that's only reserved for stealth sections. So parts like this are supposed to be trial and error, which is just fucking fantastic. So in parts like this, take caution and be slow, or dash to the closest piece of cover and live there rent free. Which required me to learn the change shoulder button, which is done with a D-pad, which is never told to us, but whatever, I'm glad I have the tendency when starting a game to touch every button to see what they do. Now the game attempts to change the combat loop halfway through the game, giving us the ability of telekinetics, where we can move stuff with our mind. Now this doesn't make the game like Control since we can't use the ability too often. In fact, we have few objects we can use it with, unlike Control where you can rip chunks of the ground off and use them as weapons. It also allows for a few more new abilities like lifting enemies or their shields, which is my main ability since getting rid of shields instantly is amazing. It's one of the few shooters where a shield enemy type isn't annoying to deal with. This also leads to new weapon mods like telekinetic bullets, which to this day, I don't know if it actually helped or if it just looks cool. It makes it so the weapon will hit where the crosshair is aiming, which looks cool but makes me wonder if the weapon is just naturally inaccurate. Now that's all the combat has, as the only thing the game throws as variety is armored enemies which just have more health. The game is a frustrating mess at times that I just can't recommend because of the problems the combat has. Now this is made by a small team, so it makes me curious to see their next game, to see if they've taken the lessons learned from this game since it has a lot of cool ideas. It just needed more focus put on the combat to really make it shine. The game story is the second highlight of the game. Since the game takes around 4-ish hours, or at least for me, I won't be talking about any spoilers. The main basics is that the character loses their identity, so the main goal of the game is figuring out how to get it back, which starts a chain of events for the character, and it feels pretty fleshed out for such a small project. A decent story can be enough for players to ignore average and bad gameplay at times, which is what helped with this game, especially in its worst parts. Now you can interact with the story as much as you want. Since these games have these talking sections, you can decide to learn more, or if you don't care, you can just move on to the next part. Something I don't really like is how the game's story ends. It just feels a bit too happily ever aftered for the whole situation. With the game being short, the less than ideal stock sounds that are used don't overstay their welcome. Since the game is made with a small team, there isn't much to say except for a lot of it sounds very stocky. I guess the only thing I can say is that the main protagonist sounds sort of out of place for me, but I think that's just due to me thinking a more gruff sounding person seems like it would fit the role a bit better, but it's all passable. The only thing that kind of blows is the game has 3 different combat tracks, which can get a bit repetitive at times since the game really prefers one of them, as the other is the game attempting a small set piece in a club followed by some bassy music. There's nothing really for me to say, it's all passable. That's Foreclosed, a game with a lot of neat concepts and ideas but in a really rough coat of paint. It makes big portions of the game beyond fun, which isn't good for a game that doesn't last long. The game is currently $20, which is a fair price for the length, but I wouldn't recommend it at full price due to the unfun nature of it. It also happens to be on PS Plus Extra or PS Plus Premium, so if you have it, you can try it out if you want. So with another game done from the backlog, I'm still deciding on what to do for the next video, but I'm thinking it has something to do with zombies. Until then, have a fantastic day.
You keep digging in my skin, what you looking for? I already let you in and you insist for more. This is a cease and desist, so consider yourself warned. You better watch yourself before I run out of options. Run out of options. I think I